you want to kick off?
Yeah, so I suppose we'll just start with asking about what position you're seeking on the executive in the upcoming elections.
Yeah, so I'll be running for president.
Cool. And why do you feel that you're the best qualified person for this position?
I think it's an interesting question because I think the reason that someone might run for president is really different to what the reasons they might give for running to be a board director. Mm-hmm. And I think the interviews you had 3 weeks ago, the kind of arguments you got as to why people wanted to be directors about parties and operations and focusing on student welfare are all really important, but are kind of different to how I could answer this question. I think the reason that I would give for running for president is because I think the role of the president is to serve as an enabler of all of the directors to execute their vision, as a conduit between the staff and members and the board, and also as someone who can lead a very particular strategic direction. And I think they're skills that I have. They're not the same as the reasons that I ran to be board director, but they are, I think, now where I see my skills working with the board.
Okay, sure. And do you have a vision for a particular strategic direction that you'd like to take the union in?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, we're in a strange position strategically in that we are now right in the middle of quite a long strategic plan, speaking, generally about this type of organisation. So it started in 2012 and will run through to 2016. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that has to constrain the directors that are on board about how they execute that strategic vision. I think the board faces some really serious problems that we haven't addressed from way back when. So even though we have our highest level of membership since VSU, still only 14,000 members, so only 1 in 5 students think it's worth joining the union. And more damningly, of all the students who buy an access card in their first year, only 20% will renew their access card into their second year. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty big indictment of the relevance of the union to students. I think if I had one kind of pitch as to what that strategic vision is, it's that, and building on what Hannah has said in the AGM, it's that the union does need to find a way to be all things to all people. It needs to, the reasons you would join the union if you are an international student who doesn't have any connections in Sydney to if you are a college student who's given the access card by virtue of where you stay on campus are really, really different. And the union has to find a way to be relevant to those communities. In terms of, that was really waffly, but in terms of actually what I think that strategic vision looks like for the board, it's that I think that the board needs to find a better way to have an outlet for the vision, the views of directors and the values of directors to have an impact on the organisation more broadly. I don't think we currently have that right. I think it currently falls into one of 2 type of camps. Firstly, we have oversight of the staff, which normally takes the kind of, it looks like questions at meetings and sort of a bit of a grandstandy, I'm wearing my big person pants and doing oversight now type stance. Or it's really project-based, which isn't to take away from those projects, but they're very rarely kind of at the heart of USU operations. They tend to be kind of extra nice things that it's nice to have, but are not at the core. So I think what my strategic vision for the way I want to enact that is to create more systems on the board for directors to be at the heart of those kind of conversations.
Okay, so what kind of systems would they be?
Yeah, so the first thing is that we currently have a system of working parties that are structured largely around what the staff need us for. They're important for staff to get together on things like the co-curricular experience, commercial operations, communications. They're important. But I think that directors need to be moved away from being part of those conversations that are important for staff to have and to think about how they can lead on the strategic points that the committee has. So what I would do is is to change up those committee systems so that they are more focused on different strategic areas. So on a strategic plan, for instance, one of them is about expanding community. One of them is about providing relevant spaces and making those commercial operations relevant. Designing structures around those so that the board directors are pushed into working, not as, so I currently sit on the co-curricular experience working party and the innovation working party. That says to me as a first year director that my jobs are the co-curricular experience and innovating. That's kind of amorphous. I want to really target it at giving goals so that those committees that the board directors are working in structure around particular goals or outcomes as to what that strategic vision could look like.
Okay, sure. And would the goals and outcomes be something that were determined by the board?
So I think they have to come from the strategic plan because that's the way the whole organisation works in the same direction. But I think there's total scope for different directors to interpret those directions differently. I think, for instance, if you say to a director that we need to we want to look at how we can change the strategic operation of the union to be more relevant to a greater number of people, which is one of the goals under the plan. It's like, well, that I have a different view of that to what Cade does, Tara, Robbie. I think getting those different views around that table would be really beneficial.
Sure. So Tim, could you evaluate, in your view, the performance of the current executive and Hannah's presidency?
Yeah, I think there have obviously been some issues with this executive. I'm not going to say I think they're perfect. I think they have done quite a good job though, in the circumstances that they're in. Particularly looking at Hannah, I think Hannah has had an executive that is for very different reasons a little bit absent, and I think that has limited some of the productivity they could have. Yep. I think probably the worst consequence of it is that one of the roles that I see second year directors playing is a really important educative function of first year directors. It's a really steep learning curve stepping onto the board. Yeah. And I think sometimes that's fallen by the wayside. And I think some of the problems that were very publicly aired about how the board feel like their particular visions have been put into place.
Yeah.
Perhaps could have been headed off a little bit earlier if there was a little bit more of that mentoring and support. I do think they've achieved a lot though. I think that Hannah has a really positive working relationship with the staff, which has been beneficial through other tumultuous problems that have arisen from that. And I'm sure we'll get to questions on staff later. But I think Hannah has had a really positive relationship there. I've always found Hannah to be really open and communicative. I know other directors have had criticisms in that regard, but that's not been my experience of working with Hannah. And I think Hannah's also had a very good relationship with other student organisations, which is one of the really important parts of the president's role that other directors don't get as much to see, you don't have direct exposure to. But like having been in those negotiations from the SRC side of the table, I know how important it is to have a strong leader from the USU who can kind of stand up for students with the authority of the USU. And I think Hannah is a really passionate advocate for students in that regard.
Sure. Are there any kind of perhaps decisions that have been taken by the board this year that you would have approached differently, or kind of strategic approach that have been taken that you would have done differently?
Do you mean just like in general board decisions, or do you mean specifically executive decisions?
Either.
Yeah, so I think, what recently springs to mind is the discussion around Senate appointed directors. I think I would have brought that up a lot earlier and headed that up earlier. That's kind of the benefit of hindsight. I think that's probably pretty unfair to the executive.
Sure.
There are decisions that come about all the time that I don't necessarily agree with. They're not big. I think on the big picture stuff about what's in the interest of students, the whole board kind of agrees. To be a little more specific in response to your question, I think perhaps some of the way that we've gone about after we've done reviews through the queer review, for instance, there was also a review of co-curricular experience that Robbie and I did. I think after some of those reviews, implementation's been a little bit sloppy, and so I think one of the things I would do differently is be more proactive in following up with staff about how those decisions have been implemented and being able to track those things through.
Okay, sure. And in terms of how Hannah has fulfilled her role as president, would you differentiate yourself in any way, or do you see the role as being any different in how you would like to execute it as president?
Yeah, I think Hannah and I are really different people. I think we have different styles in going about that, and that's true of everyone who would be running for president or who's been president in the past. I think key points of difference for me, at least, is firstly, I think the president needs to take a stronger role in terms of internally in the board in mentoring and making sure that we're supporting directors as much as they can, and also making sure that directors are held accountable for things that they say they will do and promises that they make. That's not saying that I'd be really negative, I think, on directors in that regard, but I think being firm with directors about promises and having really kind of clear lines of organisation is something that would be different. But there are a lot of things I think Hannah and I would do similarly. I think in terms of the way that Hannah has really nailed the way that you should interact with the senior staff in particular, in some respects, not in others. So I think in terms of getting the staff on side, in terms of being consultative with the staff, I think she's really great in that respect, and I would hope to continue that. I think in terms of communicating expectations to staff, we might go about that a bit differently.
What about in terms of Hannah's relationship with members of the USU? Because I know, obviously there's been a fair degree of dissent between perhaps decisions that she has made and the active membership of the USU in some way. How would you go about negotiating that relationship, do you think?
I think it's hard, because I think the premise of your question is something that we don't actually know, that members of the USU dissent from Hannah's general positions. I think going back, I've been at uni 5 years now, I don't think there has been a USU president who's drawn consensus support from among the entire student population. There were criticisms of Asta previously in terms of handling of kind of scandals and spotlights that came up there, as was true, Sabella before that. I think that's just kind of part of the way that the USU interacts with students, is you will not please everyone.
Sure.
I think that Hannah's strategy seems to be, from the way that I've seen it play out over the last year, to try to, as much as is possible, get out in front when those things happen, when there might be member disagreement, and provide as much information for members as they can. I think that's really positive. Can I say to you that I will always make decisions that 100% of members agree with? No. I think there will be people who would disagree with things that I would do as president, and that's good. That's the way the union should function. We should encourage that kind of disagreement. But the promise I would make to members in that regard, though, is to always be really open and forthright in the way that I would communicate to members, so that if you disagree with me, come yell loudly, but do so with the full information.
I'm interested in terms of, because I think probably potentially one of the issues with Hannah and Asses and previous presidencies has been they haven't actively sought to gauge the general members' views on certain issues. Would you be interested in taking steps to kind of more actively determine what those views were?
Yeah, for sure. And it's really hard. So the union tries, right? So we have members forums where we ask members to come along and give thoughts on particular things. Mm-hmm. They have a really mixed pattern of success. Some of them lots of people want to come and talk about, and that's really good. Some of them we've had one or two people show up. And that's probably just the way that consultation is going to go. What I think the union has to do probably is to diversify the way that we try to seek that opinion. So a couple of years ago, we launched USU Hub that still kind of works in the background. That was criticised as being a really PRE and a really market testing approach, and those criticisms were probably valid in the way that it was set up. What I would see though is that we probably need some sort of lower thresholds of engagement ways of communicating with members. So members forums are really good, and being open and transparent, publishing our minutes online are really important. Board blog is really important, but I don't think you're going to communicate with a 14,000 person membership through things that encourage you to come to a meeting. Like at the AGM today, we had 120 people there max. I think maybe online engagement is the key. There are fallbacks to that as well. But yeah, it's totally something to explore. And obviously we're doing the transparency review now, which will get some feedback from members on how members would like that information communicated. I'm really open to being responsive to that. But I think the core answer to your question is that we need to diversify the way that we try to engage members in that way.
And in the event that you are hearing overwhelmingly from the members of the union who are engaged, they would like an issue to be approached in a certain way, do you take that as a mandate for the board to act in a certain way?
So I think the board should always act in the interest of members. I think if your question is a poll of a particular subset of members, like if I'm standing on Eastern Ave with a clipboard and like based on the responses I get, is that how I make that decision? No, I don't think that makes that decision more or less legitimate. Because the way that I would see it is what is in the interest of students is a broader question than just what are particular things that students might be passionate about, because it's obviously an information asymmetry between the information the board has access to and the information that students have access to. I think that the board should work to correct that asymmetry, and then in that environment, my answer to your question is yes. I'm sorry, that was really convoluted.
No,
I suppose my answer is like, yeah, in theory, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, that I think that if there was a perfect set of information, if members were well informed about what was happening, then if I took something to members and said, what do you think about this? I would feel totally bound by what members think. I think that there are problems with that model, though, what we see currently, that the board should work to correct. That might mean that my answer kind of differs from what I might actually do in practice.
So you think there are situations at the moment that even when students are articulating a certain vision of their own interests, board directors may have more information or be in a better position to determine what that interest is?
Might have a broader conception of what that interest is, yeah.
So you would...
So to not dance around it, like the Tom Rowley petition is, I think, an example where I would put his head on. Obviously, I voted in favour of removing Tom from the board, and there was a vocal and a large group of students who opposed that decision. I don't think those students are wrong at all. I don't mean to say that I think that they are misinformed or ignorant. What I would say, though, is that I think that the way that I would understand the student interest is perhaps more a broader sense than what some of the directors who voted to keep Tom on would regard that. So, for instance, I would say that the way that decisions of the board impact on staff, the way that the staff operate, the way that the staff engage with the board, the way that the staff then will go on to implement views of student directors and students consulted, are all part of an equation of what is in the student interest. So does that kind of answer where you're trying to go with the question?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I in a letter to Oni in 2012, you kind of defended the autonomy of the USU in the face of universities' attempts to take it over, saying that the union's members should continue to exercise ultimate discretion over its services and activities. Do you stand by that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So do you think that the students of the USU wanted Tom Rowley to remain on board?
I think there are students of the USU who wanted Tom Rowley to remain on board and students of the USU who didn't want Tom Rowley to remain on board.
Okay. And so I suppose I'm kind of interested in why you think that your particular view is more worthwhile in terms of making that decision than the views of hundreds of students who wanted him to stay on.
Yeah, sure. I think part of it is because the board is exposed to information about the ramifications of that decision on HR and staffing, on its impact on the relationship between senior staff members and the board, senior staff members and other staff members, and the kind of HR culture that the union would like to create. And I considered that in light of the ramifications of Tom's actions on that, and then the implications of those ramifications on students and more broadly, that was not actually in the interest of students in that regard. And I there's obviously a counterpoint to that, which is that students can consider that and can consider those ramifications, and many probably did turn their mind to it. I was just convinced by the information that was presented to me as part of that, as part of the information that went to the board on that motion, that the staffing considerations in that regard were greater than was stated in what I saw from what was said by members and what was thrown around on social media.
I suppose I find it interesting that kind of like you're citing staff as kind of like one of the key rationales for your decision to vote against Tom Rowley, when like in the past, for example, you were quite heavily involved in like campaigns to ensure that the union was student run, such as like in 2012. Do you think that kind of like students and the wills of students should be really the defining driving force behind the union still, or do you think that the staff and kind of like the professional operations of the union are the more important consideration?
I think it's a false dichotomy. I mean, the actual answer to your question is always students should be the driving force of the union. Our staff are another consideration that plays into that. I reject the premise that they are at odds. I think that we have a large group of staff who work really passionately day in, day out to serve the interests of students. I don't think that any of our senior staff disregard or have low respect for the interests of students or the views of students or the wishes of students. I think if they did, they are totally in the wrong organisation. So I don't actually buy into the dichotomy of your question.
Sure. I think it's also interesting that kind of like in that calculus, you were kind of making the assumption that the staff had their own interests that they were going to be served and that were potentially going to be compromised by allowing Tom Rowley to stay on board. I'm interested in what you think the role of the staff in the running of the union should be.
I mean, the first and most obvious role of the staff is that they actually operationalise the decisions of the board. And that's right down from student leaders, from volunteers, through to our casual staff, our full-time staff and our senior staff. The main role they have in terms of the direction of the union is that they're on the ground doing things. So, I mean, 3 years ago when board had really important ethical conversations about our coffee and coffee providers, it's our staff that have to go out and seek those contracts, who have to go through those negotiations, and then who have to be on the ground when they are having conversations with students about that decision. That's an important consideration. I think also our staff bring an incredible wealth of knowledge to decision making. Does that sometimes mean there are disagreements between staff and student directors? Absolutely. But that is true of any organisation, and I don't think it means the organisation is not student run, because I think the staff are incredibly respectful of the decisions that students make. But I mean, so like, when you get onto board as a first year director and you're like, all right, here are the things I would like to do, things that I would like to see changed, it's really affirming to be able to go to staff members who have like 15 years experience in this organisation and be like, this is where it was tried before, it didn't work for these reasons, we can change it in this way, or this is what I've heard about going elsewhere. Like, that's really empowering. And I think also, there is a give and take in the way that process happens as well.
So in terms of making decisions about the direction of the union and kind of like those big strategic vision things, do you think the staff should be kind of almost, I suppose, subservient to the will of board directors and just executing in that function, or do you think that they should actually have an active input into the decisions that are being made?
I think if the decision maker in any organisation is making decisions like blind or ignorant of what the staff have to enact those decisions make, then they're a pretty bad decision maker in the first place. Like, I think if you're coming onto board and you want to make a whole bunch of decisions that the staff hate and then expect them to come into work smiling the next day and implement them, then I think you're pretty bad at being a board director.
Okay.
I think, that's based on my conviction that our staff aren't irrational and they don't irrationally or ideologically oppose things. I haven't seen the staff intervene ideologically into a discussion of board or intervene based on a set agenda. Their intervention's largely practical. But I do think that the union is guided by students, by the authority of students, and by the visions of student directors. It's just that those things are perhaps more complex than I think some people might regard them.
Okay, so there's an extent to which staff ideas and staff input into decisions should really be taken into account in determining the direction of the union.
Of course it should be taken into account. That doesn't mean it's final. That doesn't mean it's that they have a privileged position, but it is a different perspective that I think board directors should take into account.
So a couple of, in recent months, a couple of the board directors have spoken out about what they feel to be a sense of favouritism among the staff of the union. Have you experienced that at all, and what do you say to those comments?
No, I haven't. Oni asked my comment on this a couple of weeks ago, and I kind of stand by what I said there, which is that I have seen staff members, and particularly the criticisms I think were levelled at Andrew in certainly the special general meeting, they were made in relation to Andrew's conduct. Andrew has sent a number of emails around to the board asking us for opening an invitation for us all to come to him and talk about our ideas and our direction. I'm on a working party with Andrew. and two working parties with Andrew, in fact, and have always found him to be open and consultative to the views of a range of directors that have been put forward.
Yeah.
And I found that of all of the staff as well. As like a vignette example, one of the things they did on board this year was to collate for the Innovation Working Party a list of just ideas of like pie and sky blue ideas from directors that run to different areas, and then guided them through IWP and then onto different working parties where they could be put into place. And the staff came back with a whole bunch of evidence and research and things on those, of where they've tried or where they haven't, where they've been tried elsewhere. It was really helpful, and I think they've been really supportive in that sense. In terms of favouritism, and if directors feel favouritism, that's obviously bad and something that needs to be acted upon. If someone feels that way, whether it is true or not, then that is evidence of a cultural problem, totally. So, I mean, the actual answer to your question is I haven't seen it myself, but if other directors think it's there, then it's something that requires action.
Do you feel there's a certain perhaps political ideology that would situate a board director in a place where they get on better with the staff and the way the union runs at all?
No.
No? Flat out no?
Flat out no.
Okay, sure.
So kind of one of the big buzzwords around the union lately has been transparency.
Yeah.
Do you believe there's a transparency deficit in the USU currently?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's one that the board struggles to grapple with, because I think the actual answer is sort of. So there is a lot of information that the board has and makes available. Our meetings are in public for the most part, with some exceptions from camera, but we've clarified those this year. We make our minutes public. We have members forums, members can come and engage. But there is obviously, and we hear from members that they feel like they're locked out of a process, that there is something secretive that happens. Mm-hmm. So I think people feel like that's probably the case, and so the board, through the transparency review and the recommendations that come from that, should work to try to engage more members. I think the actual heart of the problem, that I'd probably say, lies not in, I mean, there are an engaged core of members who will always find ways to find out what's happening on the board, what the implications of those decisions are, and to kind of get the ear of particular directors, or to write into Oniswa, or will find a way to make their voices heard. I think the bigger problem for transparency is the fact that there are what I would describe as probably the majority of the USU's 14,000 members who don't find those things accessible, who don't find a way to have their voices heard in the union. And that is kind of the demographic to which I think transparency is also an issue. So I think it's kind of managing those positions.
Sure. Would you support any kind of formalised steps to increase transparency in the union?
I mean, with that broader proposition, yeah, totally.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas for how you could go about doing that?
Yeah. So what I said before, I think online engagement is one part of it. I think that talking to members about the internal processes of the union is one. So, for instance, I've dropped the name of two working parties in this interview, and I imagine there will be people watching this who are like, "What the hell is an innovation working party, and why do they do that?" And they're good questions. And I think that educating about the way that the board makes decisions, so that members understand at what points those decisions are taken and at what points there is like meaningful information can be disseminated, would be really beneficial. Maybe no one will sit down and read what the board's internal functions are. That's potentially the case also, but I think making those functions clearer would be a beneficial way. People seeing what that process might look like and where they might want some more input.
So in terms of actually releasing more information that is held confidential at the moment, or that is would probably not be released to the public under current regulations, would you be supportive of releasing any more of that information rather than kind of just doing more explanation?
I mean, it's irresponsible of me to answer your question in general.
Okay.
The simple answer is yes. There is information that we currently don't make public that I definitely can see a case for making public.
Okay.
There is also information that we don't make public that I think should remain not public.
Yeah. So, for example, like the details of the budget and like director spending and stuff like that, would you be in favour of greater release of that kind of information?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Tim, at the Transparency Forum recently, one item that was a topic of much discussion was this idea of dissent in the board and whether or not directors should be able to speak out against decisions that they voted against in a private board meeting. What is your position on that?
Yeah, it's firstly that dissent is good in the board and should be encouraged. We shouldn't be afraid of disagreeing on things. Those disagreements make things better. I'm not someone who likes to propose lowest common denominator things in the hope they will get passed. I like to kind of put my ideas out there and have that disagreement. And that's something that that's a value that I stick to. So that disagreement is good. In terms of directors voicing those disagreements in public, I think that directors are in a unique position to make their voices heard through internal mechanisms. I think that if you are a director, so if you by the time you disagree with a resolution of board, you've had a number of informal weekly meetings. You've had a number of working party meetings with staff. You've had the opportunity to consult your fellow directors and make your voice heard.
Yeah.
Then you've had the opportunity to speak in a meeting, and then you've had the opportunity to vote on it, which are a number of times for you to voice that opinion.
Yeah.
I think there are important structural reasons why once a decision is being made for the board, it is bad for directors to like run around, bad mouthing operations of the union. I think that has a really negative impact. I could see circumstances where that dissent doesn't have that impact though, and I think probably the board policy at the moment is too stringent. But I wouldn't say that I'm all the way the other way. Like I don't think that once a decision is made, the directors should be free to go and slag that decision in public.
Okay, so like if we were to give you a hypothetical,
Yep.
In a situation where a decision had been made that Oniswa was doing a report on, and Oniswa asked for comment from a board director who had who didn't believe that was a good decision, would you be in favour of that person being allowed to speak out against that decision in Oniswa?
It would depend on what they plan to say. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to be evasive, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that if a director intended to represent the board policy was X or Y, or that the policy of the union was X or Y, or that there was that the union wasn't in favour of that decision, then they shouldn't say that. Because the president speaks on behalf of the board, they're the conduit for the board, and they speak on policy positions of the board. But that said, I mean, you guys come along to our meetings, you've liked to our meetings. If you were sitting in a meeting and there was a vote on something, you would have heard the reasons that I disagreed with it. If you're asking me to clarify something that I said or to articulate further something that I've said in public, then it would be bizarre to have a rule that says that I couldn't clarify that position that I've already made publicly.
So you regard kind of like public perception of, I suppose, a degree of unity and smooth functioning of the board to be kind of more important than having, I suppose, that clash of ideology out there in the public domain for people to kind of engage with?
Not at all. If that's the implication that I gave, not
Sure.
what I meant at all. What I meant is that directors shouldn't be able to misrepresent board policy or to say that the board, that the union as an entity disagrees with certain decisions that have been made. That dissent is not productive.
Yeah.
There are absolutely ways for directors to make that public, that dissent known. So I think like the distinction that I would make, right, is like if you're representing your views as the views of the board, or if you're trying to undermine the board in the way that you're doing it, then you should refrain, not because of the quality of that speech, but because of the impacts of that speech.
Sure.
But like that doesn't mean that you can't clarify why you dissented on something or make that dissent known to the extent that dissent is already public.
Okay, sure. What would you see as something that regarded, that undermined the board?
Yeah, so like one of the decisions that the board makes is the evaluation of the KPIs of our CEO. That's a confidential discussion because it's an HR discussion. It would be inappropriate to. I think that if a director were to come out and say the board gave the CEO a 4 out of 5, that's rubbish. Like they're awful. I would only give them a 1 out of 5. That's rubbish. I only gave them 1 out of 5. The board's being overrun by X, Y, and Z. The decision's wrong. The organisation hates this decision. I think if they're framing it as an organisational dissent, then that's problematic. I think if they're dissenting in a way that is like releasing information that is sensitive or that like harms the operations of the union, and that's intentionally kind of vague and broad, then that's a bad thing.
Okay, sure.
Tim, moving back to the policies that you ran on a year ago, which of these have been achieved or discussed even in board since you've been on?
Yep. So one of the policies that I ran on was about orientation and changing the way that the board does orientation.
Yep.
That was, the policy is called the Fresher 5, but the policy was about changing the way that the union engages with first year students and the way that we provide a more comprehensive orientation program.
Yep.
That formed part of the review that Robbie and I did in the co-curricular experience review. Mm-hmm. That's being implemented. I mean, that's from the general position of the review that orientation needs to be made more focused, that the faculty society play a bigger role therein, and that the programs of the union, so like the Indigenous program and the humanitarian program, should play a bigger role at that stage. That's decision for staff. So that's something that's happened. In terms of the social fitness program, I got on board and was told that was already happening. That's being managed through a funds program, so that's in the offing.
Sure.
Another one was an internship database program. I started an alumni engagement. The policy was that we'd get together a bunch of alumni, encourage them to create internship programs for USC members only.
Yep.
That is obviously incredibly ambitious and is a difficult thing to start overnight. What I've done working towards that is engaging with the USU Alumni Foundation, which has been a little bit inactive, or it's had different periods of activity over its history. Looking at ways we can make the alumni network work more positively. And then through the co-curricular experience working party, I've been working with the CEO on what that structure might look like. The difficulty is that it's probably a bit of an expensive back end, but that's kind of still in the process of happening. I had a policy about renovations capital expenditure. I mean, downside, you're probably not getting a TAPS bar on the second level of Manning. I will own up to that probably not happening. The reason that is not happening is because capital expenditure doesn't work that way. And I think that what has happened is the board's approved the most ambitious capital works of the union's history, probably since the board made a decision to build the Wentworth building. And that will include some renovations in Manning. And that's a conversation that I'm part of. It probably won't amount to exactly what the policy promised. And I'm sorry, I have to be held accountable for that. But I think there are policies that speak to that, about renewing the commercial operations that have been implemented by the board.
And was that a case of kind of you had come up with this policy and then got onto board and gained access to the extent of the CapEx plans, and that's when you realised it wasn't viable?
I don't think it's not viable. I think that it is. I think that I buy that in the conversations. I've been persuaded in conversations there are more the other capital expenditure. There are reasons why it should be prioritised. Like there are reasons why the Fisher Coffee Cart and Castle should be prioritised over a Manning redevelopment. I just bought those reasons. They were very persuasive.
Sure. And your fifth major policy was equity grants. Is anything happening with that?
So again, accessibility was kind of part of the conversation that was had. Sorry, equity grants were about accessibility of programs run by clubs and societies. The answer to your question is no, largely. They are part of the co-curricular experience review. They're also part of a review that's currently being done by the board on how we can better engage with the university to engage demographics of students that don't normally engage with the union. So, I mean, the short answer is no. The long answer is it's something that I still think is a good idea. It's just about where that kind of fits in.
Yeah, sure.
So I suppose the most recent USU election that we've just seen kind of marked out quite a definite shift to the left, I think, in terms of the board's political makeup. How do you think your politics fit in with this shift?
I think I'm a left-wing and progressive director. I don't think I'm marginalised by that shift.
I suppose one of the things that was particularly interesting to us was that if you're successful in this executive election, you'll be at the head of a board of which 9 of 11 people would have voted in the opposite direction to you on Rowie, which has kind of become, I suppose, a litmus test for a lot of people in terms of like political ideology. I mean, how would you manage serving at the head of a board that's potentially kind of quite united against you on such a major issue?
So I suppose the first thing I would say is I reject that the Rowie vote is a litmus test for someone's politics or the way that they might engage with the interests of students or the union in general. My vote on the Tom Rowie vote had nothing to do with any view that I hold about Tom's politics. Tom is a really good advocate for students on the board. He's been really effective in 2 years on board. My vote wasn't about not liking Tom or not agreeing with Tom, and I think to frame it like that is kind of disingenuous. I think there are people, and that wasn't at you, I think there are a lot of people who frame it like that, and I think it is disingenuous from all of them. I think that I just rejected that vote as a litmus test for how someone might view politics, their political position, or the union in the way that it should interact with students. I think there are directors who I will serve with next year who I disagreed on the Tom Rowie vote. I don't regard them as wrong. I think that the way that I viewed that decision, at least, was it was about different interpretations of how someone ought to execute their functions as in the interest of students. I think they're legitimate disagreements. They're legitimate differences of opinion for people who might otherwise agree on a whole range of issues.
Okay, so if we assume that kind of, I suppose we can take the Rowie vote as an indication, if not a test, of the fact that you do disagree with perhaps 9 of the 11 people about what their role as board director should be and how the union kind of and its board should function in that way. How would you kind of manage that, given that you do have that disagreement?
I would say that I've managed working in environments where I disagree with people all the time. I was an office bearer in the SRC in the year that the General Secretary tried to remove the acknowledgement of country and replace it with an acknowledgement of the Anzacs. Like, I've been in intense political environments where I disagree with people. I think that anyone who gets involved in any element of student politics knows that there are lots of legitimate disagreements. And I think part of being a director and part of being one of the 13 people who is charged with the best interests of the union is kind of being bigger than that and recognising that everyone, all of the directors, the ones who I agree with all the time, the ones who I disagree with more times than not, are all incredibly passionate and hardworking people, and I don't disrespect any of them for those decisions. I think it is very easy to rise above the fact that you disagree to realise that those disagreements are actually productive for the union. And I trust the directors who have been elected and were elected with me to be able to do that.
Sure. So I suppose my question is that, you're not you wouldn't be one of 11 or 13 in this sense. You'd be at the head of an organisation that and kind of leading these people who potentially do disagree with you, would you defer to their in the circumstance where those 9 people did disagree with the decision you were going to make?
Yeah, totally.
Would you defer to them?
It would suck to be president of an organisation and think that everyone has to agree with you. That would be a really awful form of leadership.
Okay.
I would say as a counter to that though that I think I can probably count on one hand the number of votes the board has had this year in which we were split as divisively as we were on the Tom Rowley vote. The board functions largely by consensus, and I think one of the reasons why I would say that I could still be at the head of that organisation rather than 1 in 13 is that I think I have quite a lot of experience working in those environments and in trying to build that type of consensus and in managing those disagreements, both within the union but also in other organisations.
Just on politically heated environments, I think post the Rowley decision there was a lot of talk about divisions in the board. Do you think that these kind of divisions will run over into the next board? Do you see them as being an impediment?
I hope not. I think that question is really difficult to answer because I think that comes down to how whoever is on the next executive decides to manage the board. I think it would be very easy to step into the presidency and decide that you have the numbers and there are people on the board who disagree with you, so fuck them, sideline them. I think that's irresponsible, and I think the history of the union shows that type of decision making is irresponsible. Could it lead to division? Yeah, absolutely. I think that with a strong executive team and good leadership, I don't think it will. I think that, part of being the president is about managing the different personalities, the different positions, the different political ideologies, the different ways of working and ways of thinking on the board. That's why I want to be president, because I think that managing those type of positions is something that I'm good at, something that I do think will have a real impact on reducing those tensions.
Okay. The 2 Senate-appointed directors, as you well know, of the board do have an option to cast a vote in the executive election. Have you sought their vote in your presidential campaign?
Emma and Simone are both way too smart for someone to lobby them. That's just, from what I've seen of them working over the last year, I don't think that's how they function.
So have you had conversations about them, about whether they would vote or who they would potentially vote for? With
Emma and Simone?
Yeah. No? Okay. And so you never kind of approach them to discuss your qualifications or anything like that?
Yes. Last year when I was running for honorary secretary, I have, but if you mean since then, no.
Okay, cool. What do you think about, aside from the fact that you think Emma and Simone are too kind of intelligent to be lobbied, if they weren't, do you think that principally people should lobby Senate appointed directors to vote for them?
I think that's a hard question. Would I? No, probably not. I think the whole lobbying process on board of any director is kind of absurd. This is election with an electorate of 13 people potentially. The personality politics are totally weird, and you can only really understand it when you've been through it. I think it's important to talk to all directors about what your views of the union are. I don't disrespect candidates for that. I think that if Emma and Simone decide to vote, then they should be informed in the way that they make that vote, and that would be true if they were, not intelligent or have the capacity to be swayed by flashy politics.
What do you mean they should be informed?
As in, I think if you make the decision to vote, no matter who you are, no matter which whether you're a Senate appointed or elected director, you should do so on an informed basis. So I think that if I didn't have presuming I didn't have any faith in their capacity to make that decision, then I would expect that they would do so in an informed fashion. So I suppose the short answer to your question is that I wouldn't think it would be illegitimate for a candidate to, but I probably would.
And what do you think about the fact that kind of the board recently made a recommendation to these Senate appointed directors that they not cast votes in the executive election?
I think it's tricky. I don't wholly agree with it, phrased as you do. To make my position really clear, I don't think there should be Senate appointed directors. I recognise that there is absolutely a need for the board to seek professional advice, and we encounter that all the time. I think the best way to do that is on an ad hoc and as needs basis. Mm-hmm. But I think that if there are Senate appointed directors, then what the university is doing, and they're doing it on behalf of members of the organisation, is asking 2 people to take on what is quite a high legal burden. They are personally responsible for everything that happens in the union, and they may be indemnified, but that's not guaranteed on each basis. Further to that, they are professional people with careers, and so they are taking a lot of responsibility on behalf of members of the organisation. I think in that environment, there's certainly no legal case for them to not vote. And I am uneasy with, putting the case to them forcefully. But I mean, that doesn't really answer your question. I think that they shouldn't be there in the first place. If they're there, then I have no objection to them voting.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's kind of on a legal basis rather than like a principled one, I suppose. Though.
Well, no, as in I think it is on a principle. I think the principle derives from the legal burden that they bear.
Mm-hmm.
If you want me to articulate the principle, do I think that only students should have a say over the executive?
Mm-hmm.
Then yeah, totally. But I don't think that's the hand we're dealt here.
Okay.
Sorry, that
yeah,
was
that seems fair. I suppose interesting broad question to conclude on is what you perceive kind of like the role and ambit of the USU to be.
Yeah, interesting question. And I think the answer does come back to the USU is a whole bunch of things. The USU, for some people, is just an opportunity for them to debate once a week and go to international tournaments. The USU, for some people, is the opportunity to get drunk, to have onesie parties. For some people, it's a really important way to find a community on campus that they feel alienated from. It's a support base for students who are at risk or disadvantaged. The union has a role in welfare. It has a role in providing services for mothers on campus. And they are all really important and integral to the union. I think the role of the union is broader than the way that Oni's like to paint the union this year. I think painting us as like a onesie-wearing ball party body is disingenuous to the broad scope of work the union actually does. And I also think it underplays the value of entertainment and of those commercial operations in actually building a campus people want to go to. I'm happy to hear criticisms of people in onesie parties, but I think that to a student who comes from a rural and regional area, from interstate or from overseas, who doesn't know anyone, those kind of party environments, those kind of social interactions are really important. So the union has a role in providing entertainment. The union has a role in student welfare. That's kind of where I see the union being.
Do you think it has a role as an activist body? I know some people want to shift it in that direction.
Yeah, some people do, and I think potentially. I don't think it has the same role as the SRC. I think that and the reason for that is really clear. The SRC has a much broader democratic mandate in the policies that it sets up. Like when the SRC makes decisions on policy, it's with a 33-member council that is notionally, ideologically, politically, and generally representative of the body in a way that a board of 11 elected as 5 and 6 can't quite be.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a constituency who wants USU to be more activist? Yeah, totally. And for those people, there should be services and parts of the union that provide that. Is that the whole function of the union? No. And I think there are equally students who feel alienated by that. And the union has research that says that a large number of students feel alienated by the union being too political. I don't have an answer for what that means, but that's the response that they gave. So yes and no.
So I suppose assuming that, so at the moment we have an executive, or this year, in the year upcoming, we'll have an executive that is going to be made up of probably largely or really solely left-wing voters who would probably not voted, board directors who would be against fee deregulation, for example. Do you think it's within the ambit of the union to come out and comment on fee deregulation on a federal political level? Yeah,
again, it's case by case for me. It really depends on what issue we're talking about. Fee deregulation for me is a clearer issue than other things you could have picked as your example, because fee deregulation, I think, plays really clearly into the union's role to be an advocate for the welfare of its students. And I think that is reasonably clear. I think the union can play different roles in supporting those kind of on-campus conversations and those and that activism than the SRC can. And I think it's important to think about how the union can differentiate itself in that space. So one of the things that I value about the union is that, we have 2 of the oldest political clubs in the country. I think we are an interesting forum for debate. I think we've moved away from that kind of forum of public debate that I think would be really interesting avenues to pursue in that regard. So yeah, I think the union does have a place. Whether that is necessarily the same place as the SRC, I'm skeptical whether it is always that way. But yeah, case by case basis, totally.
Cool. Great. Thanks, Tim.
Cool. Thanks very much.